Thank you, Ambassador Ving. I just also want to say that Mr. Ving just arrived in the U.S. A little bit more than a month ago, and this is one of his first trips. And through his speech, you can see that the serious interest of the Vietnam government in getting opinion from scholars from this conference. So we really appreciate that. We have a list of very impressive speakers today. But let me first start with the first section, the first panel. And I would like to invite our first speaker, which is Professor David Dapice from Harvard and Tufts Universities. He usually based here, but this time he is in Ho Chi Minh City at the Fulbright Economic Teaching Program, and he will speak with us from Ho Chi Minh City. David, are you there?
I am.
So the talk of David is titled China, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam is the same lake. So do you have the slides over there, David?
Are they coming across there or not?
I think
we are showing now.
Hold on.
If you're not getting it from here, maybe you could use the file I sent.
No, I'll show you. I'll show the slide in a second. I think I'm seeing a slide, which is this one. Yep. Okay. This is so the slide is a broadcast from Ho Chi Minh City. I think it's on Zoom, Professor Zoom computers, and I think it's showing right now. David, I think you can start, and when you want to move the slide, you can ask Dr. Zhu to move the slide.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. First of all, thank you to Nafang and all of the organizers. I'm honored to be starting this symposium. Of course, it will make it easier for the others to look good, but that's okay. I'm wearing a short sleeve shirt just to taunt you. It's very nice here. And the economy, however, is not as nice as the weather. The first working slide there shows since 2009 the GDP per capita in comparable terms, and the top line, of course, is blue, is China. Next comes Indonesia, and then the green line, which is just above the sort of red line, is India, and Vietnam is just below India. So what this shows is, in absolute terms, a growing gap, even in just the last 5 years, between Vietnam and other 3 countries. Now, why did I choose these 3 countries? Well, they're all countries that either are growing or have grown very rapidly. They're significant countries. Vietnam is 90 million people, which is not small, but the others are even larger, with China and India, of course, being well over 1 billion, and Indonesia being 250 million people. Now, I think those of you economists who have studied growth theory know that if a country is poorer, it should be growing faster, and other things being equal in terms of the growth rate. And we all know that a smaller country is more open, and it should be more agile. It should be easier for a smaller country to shift from one thing to another than a very large one. The other points I want to make about all of these countries is Vietnam has by far, I think, the best geography. You know, basically one road and some ports connect most of the population and production in Vietnam. In Indonesia, you have thousands of islands, very complicated investment for transport and electricity. You can't have a central grid in the same way. China and India, of course, are continental countries and have much more complex problems of tying themselves together. And a fourth point I'd like to make is Vietnam has an easier ethnography. China, of course, has problems with the Uyghurs and Tibet. While not a large share of population, it certainly demands some attention. India, of course, is well known for its Kashmir and really open conflict in the east, where there's what's called a Maoist or Naxalite army over quite a large share of the country, and that's partly an ethnic problem because there are minorities doing that. And Indonesia, of course, has had huge problems in Aceh, in Irian, with its minorities, and Timor actually broke away some years ago. Vietnam, basically 90% kin, and the minorities are not nearly as problematic. So Vietnam should be doing well. It's poorer, which makes it easier to grow. It's smaller, which should make it more agile. It has easier geography and easier ethnography. And indeed, from 1990 to 2010 or so, 2008, as you can see, Vietnam grew faster than India and Indonesia, and while not as fast as China, you know, China was really storing up problems, especially environmental problems, but perhaps other kinds of problems, which really, you know, probably should detract from the measured growth rate if you include the externalities, more so perhaps than the other countries. If we shift to the next slide, this is growth from 2010 to 2014, and here China again is fastest, though it has slowed down significantly. Indonesia speeds from last to second to best, and India, which is misspelled, and Vietnam bring up the rear. And this is especially disappointing for Vietnam because, again, with all of these advantages, you would expect it to be growing faster than at least India and Indonesia. Let me just say something about India and Indonesia during this period. Both India and Indonesia have recently elected very promising presidents, fairly. Jokowi in Indonesia and what's his name? Modi in India. But under the previous regimes, Indonesia had really a pretty mediocre president who was very comfortable with the crony economy and managed it, but didn't really move things forward. I just got in from Jakarta in the last day or two, and I can tell you that many Indonesians were not very happy with the previous president. And likewise in India, the previous government was notoriously corrupt, inept. They had large social programs which were plundered or misused by a bureaucracy which was not accountable. And we would not expect either of those countries in this period of 2010 to 14 to have been very well performing. Instead, what we see is Indonesia grew faster. India grew as fast as Vietnam, which should have really been much more impressive in its growth rate. Why don't we go to the next slide? And this says something else about Vietnam. From the data on foreign direct investment, I took Vietnam as a share of ASEAN in the last 5 years or so. And what you can see is the share has more than fallen in half. Vietnam started with nearly 20% of ASEAN's FDI, and it now gets less than 8%. Even in nominal terms, Vietnam's FDI has fallen since 2008, whereas all of ASEAN went up by 150%. So Vietnam got a negative share of a huge growth in ASEAN FDI. And, you know, FDI is very unemotional. It assesses the growth prospects in a country, and if they think they can make money, they go in. If they think they cannot make money, they stay away. And I should say something, because while this graph is completely correct, it doesn't tell the whole story. In per capita FDI, which I have not shown, Vietnam is still higher than the other countries, but it is completely losing its relative advantage. In other words, the other countries are catching up, even in per capita terms. And not India, but China and especially Indonesia. And again, you would expect Vietnam to be much higher per capita because of its relatively small size. The larger the country, typically the lower in population, the lower the per capita FDI. So this suggests that you know, in spite of the per capita number, there's something wrong with you know, the way the rest of the world perceives Vietnam. I'm going on too long. I'll try to speed it up. The governance changes. These are World Bank governance data. I've just added up the percentiles. What you can see is Indonesia is rising. There in this graph, the green curve that's rising. Vietnam and China are basically moving sideways for the last 10 years or so. And India, has, reflecting the previous government, has actually gotten worse. So one reason that we might see Indonesia improving a lot in the FDI and Vietnam really lagging is these governance numbers. Why don't you go to the next slide, please? Okay, this is one of those slides that you should never show at a conference. It's way too complicated. It's from an IMF study looking at sources of growth in various countries. And there's the only thing I want you to get from this is the top black line is the total amount of growth, and Vietnam has been pretty much declining since 1994. It was helped a little, or at least leveled off with the enterprise law, but in the last 5 years or so really has been falling off. Indonesia has been rising. India, you know, peaks, as does China, just before the world financial crisis. The only other thing I want you to see from this graph is the bottom line is green, is total factor productivity. If you're going to keep growing, this is what you need. Population growth, the workforce growth slows down. You can't keep investing at very, very high levels forever and building your capital stock. You can, of course, keep educating people. That's a deeper blue. But really, what you want is a high level of total factor productivity. And, you know, that green line is very, very low for Vietnam. Go to the next slide. This just takes out the total factor productivity change. China is very high. India and Indonesia are sort of in the middle. And Vietnam is very, very low, you know, lower than most countries. So this suggests that while Vietnam has grown at close to 6%, it really has not done nearly as well as we would like, or even as most of its competitors. So, you know, what the other, just last slide. This shows you per capita GDP according to the World Bank in purchasing power comparable terms in the last 25 years. And as you can see, Vietnam has grown, and it's grown a fair amount, but it's fallen well behind China. And if you're trying to stay independent and keep degrees of freedom, if you know, are really very, very poor relative to a giant neighbor, chances are the giant neighbor will have a lot to say. And so I think to bring this circle around, if you're concerned about the ability of Vietnam to stand by itself and have some real independence, you should be worried about this graph. You know, China's going to slow down in the next 10 years. Will Vietnam speed up? I think that's the question we want to talk about. Why don't I stop there and take questions if there's time, and I'm sorry I went on so long. Are we, well, I'm done. Questions or not buying? Not buying? Can't hear him.
David, can you hear now?
I can hear you now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, okay, yeah. We turned it off during your presentation, but now the microphone is on. I would like to invite the audience to make questions and comments for